I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Rachel Bovard.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. On today's show, we have four big topics, four very important topics. We're going to start with discussing the militarization of Capitol Hill, which is stunning. If you live here or if you don't, this is our capital city, and if you could see it, you would understand why it's stunning. We're going to then talk about the southern border. We're going to talk about Dr. Seuss, and we're going to talk about renewed calls for reparations. So let's start right now by kicking it off to Ben so he can fill us in on what's going on Capitol Hill.
Thanks, Emily, and I look forward to your insights on what it actually looks like in what is supposed to be the people's capital, but which right now is increasingly the ruling class's fortress against some unknown, undefined enemies. And we know this because there have now been constant bulletins put out by varying agencies within our national security apparatus claiming that there are threats with very thin, vague language, no actual substantiation that we know of, essentially asserting that whether it's QAnon or right-wing extremists, white supremacists, et cetera, pose a threat to the Capitol and to the lives and limbs of lawmakers as well. Now, recall, first of all, that the Capitol riot is, of course, the underlying sort of justification for continuing up this hyped threat environment. But in spite of those stated threats, there was no attack on the Capitol on March 4th, as was reportedly put out and previewed in a joint report by the DHS and FBI last week that required this massive mobilization on Capitol Hill. Essentially, no one showed up on Capitol Hill. State houses were never stormed on or around Inauguration Day. The Capitol riot itself, the notion that this was an insurrection, a treasonous act aimed at actually overtaking the Capitol, has been belied by the fact that the vast majority of criminal cases brought involve misdemeanors. Not one person was actually armed with weaponry on Capitol Hill. That's a response that Senator Ron Johnson elucidated, and then he got attacked as a Russian agent by some members of the punditocracy as well. The only person to really die during those events as a consequence of the riots was Ashley Babbitt, one of the people who was trying to breach the Capitol unlawfully, apparently. So we have this hyped up, hysterical threat about our democracy, our republic being under attack. And it doesn't seem to be met with any sort of substantiation or empirical evidence to suggest that the mobilization is commensurate with that threat. And I would raise a couple points here. First, the administration put out its interim national security strategic guidance about a week ago. And it says, and I quote here, domestic violent extremism challenges core principles of our democracy and demands policies that protect public safety while promoting our values and respecting our laws. We must adapt our approach to counterterrorism, including by aligning our resources to evolving threats. We will work as a coordinated, unified federal government to use the full array of tools at our disposal. And it goes on to say, in concert with other authorities and counterparts as well. Robust law enforcement and intelligence capabilities, it writes, will be brought to bear here. So as we've previewed here before, we're talking about a war on terror being brought against American citizens at home by the administration in its most authoritative national security strategy document to date. Two other points worth making. It's readily apparent that there's a contrast here between the walling off of the people's house on the one hand, and on the other hand, as we'll get to later in this episode, the open borders that we're currently witnessing. Another point worth making from someone who's observed this as well is that on the one hand, we have this fencing off of democracy for the people, and analogously, we have the securing of democracy for the people via HR 1, and both of these, of course, are euphemisms masking that the exact opposite is actually what's taking place. So with that long windup, I want to go actually first to Emily to talk about your impressions as someone who has walked the Capitol fencing. What do you make of the fact that there is this apparent chasm between the ruling class, which gets to be protected, and then everyone else left defenseless?
Well, I think this has to do with Democrats wanting strategically to keep January 6th in the news and in focus as long as they possibly can. It is completely political from their perspective. They have made the decision that it is politically expedient for them to focus on January 6th. And that's why partially I think you see the fencing. I have walked the whole fence just about. I did it for a video with the Federalist, and you can watch that on YouTube. Actually, just to like show, I was surprised. We took video of the entire fence almost, and to get that time lapse together of the entire thing, it's actually crazy. And if you have been, it's crazy how even in the time lapse, how long it took for us to get around the whole fence. It's really big, and that might not sound like a big deal. It might sound like a local issue. It might still strike you as something that's temporary. But if you've been to Washington, D.C., and if you do a lot of work on Capitol Hill, as Rachel and I do, it's really, really pretty shocking how much space in the city is now fenced off. You can be like more than a quarter of a mile, definitely more than a quarter of a mile from the Capitol on the National Mall, and you're still behind a fence. And so it does really affect the way that Washington works. I have absolutely no problem with ratcheting up security. In the weeks that followed January 6th, the couple of weeks that followed January 6th, if there are immediate threats to the security of the members and to our Republican, like the voting process, et cetera, great. But clearly they do not exist at any level that would justify this fencing. And so, again, it's not just a local issue. It's not just symbolic, and it's not just temporary. It's a stunning amount of our capital city engulfed in fencing for political purposes by the Democrats.
Yeah,
so
Rachel, go ahead, Josh. No, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, hypocrisy is just like the glaringly obvious thing that leaps off the page here. I think it's going to be a recurring theme of this entire podcast, kind of previewing our next topic at the southern border as well. But, I think back to a Substack that Seth Barron, who's the new managing editor of the American Mind website, had a couple weeks ago. The theme of his Substack post was the phrase "our democracy," and how the left, from Pelosi down to AOC, down to Gavin Newsom, Cuomo, any of these guys, to say over and over again how much, quote, "our democracy," close quote, is completely under siege on all sides. So yes, everything that Ben and Emily have said about this being a continuous power grab, we think back to Rahm Emanuel's famous quote about never letting a good crisis go to waste. All of that is true. But just the searing imagery of what we're seeing, and I haven't been to DC since the pandemic started. I'm flying in a couple of weeks for a very quick turnaround, but so I guess I'll see it then. But like the imagery that we see on television, contrasted with the "our democracy" rhetoric, as Ben said, contrasted with HR1, this entire monstrous proposal to completely federalize elections, effectively aid and abet voter fraud, et cetera. The hypocrisy is almost just too much to bear, honestly. And I think back also to an essay that Bill Vogeley, the Claremont Review of Books editor, wrote at Manhattan Institute's City Journal website in January. It was a fabulous essay. It was about the term "whataboutism." This is a term that we've heard a lot about during the Trump presidency, right? I think a lot of Trump skeptical right of center pundits, Jonah Goldberg comes to mind. People like this have said, "Oh, whataboutism," criticize Trump when need be, and like fine when he overstepped. I think a lot of us did call him out, but "quote unquote" whataboutism is not this crazy thing. In fact, what the entire rallying cry of whataboutism is getting at is a criticism that we are not actually living in a true equality under the law regime, in a true kind of equal protection clause regime where everyone is held equally accountable and everyone is treated equally. So applying that to what we're seeing now, if this is the reaction after what happened on January 6th, where is the remotely close to equivalent reaction to everything that we saw last summer? And, some people listening to this podcast will be like, "Oh, Hammer, talking about whataboutism." No, it's not whataboutism. It is literally a call for like events, or in this case, unlike events, January 6th being orders of magnitude less draconian than what happened throughout last summer, but at least for similar events to be treated equally. So sorry for that little mini rant. I do want to hear Rachel's thoughts, but I had to get that one off my chest.
No, I think it's well said because, you have publications like the New York Times gaslighting us still about what happened over the summer. So I think it's worth pointing out. They had a story, I think it was yesterday or the day before about, Hispanic men in the Republican Party. And they made the point that, people were being lied to, saying that Black Lives Matter protests were violent. And somehow that was a lie that Hispanic men were being told. And it's like, are we living on the same planet in which, $2 billion worth of damage was claimed to insurance company across, 100 cities this summer, in which 25 people were killed in related violence, to these riots? And so I think it's a point worth making that people aren't treating these things similarly at all. And I think, again, what's fascinating to me about all of this is this such blatant opportunism, right? We haven't even talked about the fact that the National Guard troops are going to stay here for 2 more months. 2,000 troops are going to be here for at least 2 more months for unspecified threats. And I think this was what was so stunning about last week on March 4th, when the House adjourned early. The day before on March 3rd, because they were, in fear. They fled the Capitol, clutching their pearls in fear of what was supposed to be a riot that was going to come on March 4th. A riot, by the way, that the FBI confirmed to the Washington Post on March 3rd that they had no evidence of any, incoming threat. At most, they had some internet chatter, but no evidence of a threat or a protest at this time. FBI said this on the record to Washington Post. The House still fled, right, in theatrical terror for the purpose of, as Emily said, keeping January 6th in the news, keeping this looming specter of a possible attempt on their lives, in full view of everyone. Meanwhile, the Senate, this was such a fake threat that the Senate, who, by the way, hates working, will take any excuse to not do anything at any time. Even the Senate couldn't bring itself to be like, yeah, a few internet trolls probably said something. We're still going to stay here anyway. The fact that the Senate stayed here through the weekend shows just what a fake and opportunistic view of theater this entire thing is. And again, it requires people to actually call it out as such. And we have a corporate media that has no interest, a corporate media that is still gaslighting us about the Black Lives Matter violence. So I do think it's worth calling this out.
I just want to jump in really quickly to say the National Guard point is super important because, again, if you are walking the perimeter of this fencing, the city is crawling with National Guard members, particularly on the Hill. It's not their fault, but they're like militarized National Guard members. I mean, that's kind of redundant, but they're out there with like guns and on peaceful Capitol Hill at every possible entrance to this fence, walking the perimeter the entire time like it's a war zone.
Armed, heavily armed.
Tanks in the Senate parking lot. I don't know if they're technically tanks, but they're big military trucks in the Senate parking lot. And it's really, really wild to see it in person.
Yeah, just to put a bow on it, I mean, I think Josh's point is really critical. If you have a double standard of justice, you have no justice system whatsoever. And the people who clutch their pearls about our democracy should not ever use the word justice to describe whatever it is they're pursuing, because it's antithetical to justice. And ultimately, we have to ask at the end of the day, to what end? To what end are we going to have these endless hysterics about these threats put forth, turn into nothing burgers, yet continue to have a militarized Capitol where, again, it's the visible representation of the chasm between the ruling class and the people who are unfortunate enough to be ruled by them, which is probably a good segue into our next segment on the southern border.
Yeah, so obviously we have a very tightly controlled border to Washington, D.C. right now. And, in a lot of other cities that are completely still locked down, absent the military. But at the southern border, we are open for business. And, it's been fascinating to watch the Biden administration refuse to call anything that's going on at the border a crisis, merely a challenge. Well, in fact, they're seeing 70,000 crossers at the border a month, which is the highest in a decade. ICE came out today and said they have over 3,000 children, unaccompanied minor children, in custody at the border, over 8,000 unaccompanied children in HHS custody. This is the highest in 20 years. And they're being held in exactly the same conditions as the last 2 administrations, same facilities. And this, 3 years ago was headline news every single day. And, I think even more to this point, and this is something that the Federalist has done really good reporting on, is the fact that, this isn't just a spontaneous eruption of people wanting to cross our southern border. What is happening at the border is the actions of criminal cartels, transnational criminal enterprises who make billions of dollars a year from human trafficking. This is big business. And our public policy continues to treat it as if it is just, again, people just wanting to come here for, to better their lives. They do want to better their lives, but to do that, they are selling themselves to smugglers. The Rand Corporation had a study a couple of years ago that looked into this and said these cartels make $2 billion a year from trafficking. And this is not, these are not pleasant conditions. I don't know how else to characterize it, right? This is human flesh being trafficked, women and girls raped on the way up to the border, people perishing on the way because they're treated like chattel. They are a product, to these smugglers. And so this is, open criminal activity at the border. And yet, somehow it's not a crisis. It's just a challenge. And I think it's worth pointing out that what's interesting about this is that, what Trump was relentless about the border issue. And of course, all of the attention was paid to the family separation policy, which was admittedly a very gruesome policy. But at the same time, what he actually did was more than that, right? He put in place the migrant protection protocols, which essentially said, look, if you're going to come claim asylum, you can do that, but you have to wait in the countries of Central America, instead of being released into the interior of the country, which is what the Biden and Obama administrations have done. That proved that this is all incentive-based, right? The incentive is if you can get in the country, you can stay while you wait for your hearing. You remove that incentive, the border crossings dropped substantially. And if you've spent any time at the southern border, I was there, I guess, a year and a half ago now, talking to Border Patrol, they call that migrant protection protocol system a game changer. It changed everything for them on the southern border. They were no longer being overwhelmed. It cut off the criminal activity at the knees. But it wasn't just that. Trump also basically required more from our southern border neighbors. He was willing to suggest a tariff on Mexico if Mexico couldn't, get itself together and essentially control the flow of its people to the US border. He did the same thing with Honduras, with Guatemala. He entered into safe third country agreements, which are the standard agreements for migration across Europe and in Canada. He enforced those agreements with these countries. So, he did a lot more than I think people give him credit for. And I think what he did demonstrated how much incentives matter. This is an incentives game. That's all it is. And if you remove the incentives, you drop substantially the problem that we're dealing with, which again is one of criminality. And then the last point I want to make too is I think, what Trump taught Republicans about immigration is that it is possible to be firm on the border. It is possible to take aggressive action and still win Hispanic votes. There was a fascinating interview with David Shore in New York Magazine last week, who's a Democratic strategist who talked about this idea that Hispanics are actually not as far to the left as many Democrats want them to be. That when you poll Hispanics and you present them with Democratic border policies like open borders, like decriminalizing border crossings, they hate it. They move toward the center. They actually move toward Republicans in those positions. And so that is upended, I think, the way in which Republican consultants have taught Republican candidates to talk about immigration. So we can now, I think, as a party, start to reform ourselves with how we talk about it. Border security matters, immigration as a labor issue matters, and immigration reform, globally, I think matters. And these are three things the Republican Party should not let go because look, we're not getting any help from the corporate press who won't cover this. We're not getting any help from the Biden administration who's pretending this isn't an issue. So look, this is a ripe issue for Republicans to engage upon.
This is the second straight week that we're covering the southern border issue, which I think underscores the magnitude of what's happening right now and what we're seeing. And it kind of also only accentuates the chasm between, what folks like we in this podcast, kind of the median American, are seeing, what the Biden administration is saying. They're not even calling it a crisis. They won't even deign to use the word that everyone in their right mind knows it is. So, look, Rachel framed this issue extraordinarily well. I'm not sure they have a ton to add. I would just kind of emphasize from a less policy and slightly more kind of political theory, for less of a better term, amnesty, open borders, immigration. Yes, it is terrible policy for any number of reasons. Okay, we're kind of seeing, with like Orrin Cass' American Compass, kind of the resurgence of kind of a restrict immigration kind of for tight labor markets line of argumentation, the likes which we kind of heard from Jeff Sessions when he was in the Senate, Tom Cotton. That I think is very much gaining steam. But there's something I think even more profoundly unjust about open borders and about amnesty in general. There is no more pressing issue, I have thought for for years. I mean, since I started following politics and immigration, because it is the one issue not only that affects every single area of life, every single one, culture, national security, economics, foreign policy, like you name it, it literally touches on every single one. But even more profoundly than that, at kind of a slightly higher level of theory, immigration is the means by which the polity chooses who it is. It is literally how a citizenry defines who the members are. And if you go back to the founding era, if you look at the Federalist Papers, if you look at the way Madison, Hamilton, all the great founding fathers discussed this issue, they understood this intuitively. They didn't even have to be said. They actually viewed the notion of not even large scale, of mid-scale immigration quite skeptically. The notion was that a migrant, a prospective immigrant to this country, truly had to prove his or her bona fides in order to merit entry into the citizenry, into the body politic. So, look, for so long in the 20th century, the Democrats, after they really kind of became the big party that were in hock to the AFL-CIO and the labor unions, really going up through the Clinton era, honestly, really kind of took this more kind of pro-labor, tight labor markets, enforcer immigration law stance. But it also just underscores the way in which the intersectionality wing of the Democratic Party has just truly eviscerated all. And, we'll see that in our next couple of segments as well. But identity politics, intersectionality, I think at this point are very clearly the future of left of center in America. The flip side of that, to kind of just tie it back in real quick to what I was saying about like the founding fathers, the flip side of that is that intersectionality and identity politics are fundamentally anathema to the American regime, the American creed, and the American way of life. There is nothing that you can possibly reconcile between the anthem, the ethos of the Declaration of Independence, the ethos of the Constitution itself, meritocracy, individual, right and wrong, justice, et cetera. There's no way to reconcile that with this notion of kind of race, class-based hierarchical privileges, the likes of which the open borders crowd is very clearly trying to do. So I think there is a really ripe opportunity here for the right, because the median American, to kind of go back to what Rachel was saying, looking at Hispanic voters in particular, the median American does not buy into this. They just don't.
Well, I want to return to a point that Rachel made really early in her comments, which was that this is a transnational, multi-billion-dollar industry. And what that means, that brings us to a theme that we explore a lot on this show, and rightfully so. What you have is an elite class literally profiting off of the exploitation of impoverished, desperate people in Central America. When you think about it, that's what's happening. If you are defending practices that, as Rachel says, incentivize people to come to the border and risk life and limb, we see parents packing their young girls with birth control because they anticipate that they will be raped. When you see situations like that happening, the money is going to the cartels, and the cartels are exploiting desperate, impoverished people who are trying to find a better life in America. And the system of incentives is such, which is set up by our ruling class, the system of incentives is such that people go through hell to get to the border, and the money on the way is going to the cartels and propping them up to further exploit people in Mexico and Central America. And so for our elite class to defend these practices and to create a system of incentives that exacerbates the problem and empowers the cartels, which is exactly what it does. It empowers the cartels because you have more and more migrants coming up through Central America and Mexico, which means more and more money is going to the cartels and more people are at serious risk. When you have a system of incentives that creates that, it's really, really disgusting to see how powerful people, once again, are using their positions of power to create a worse situation for impoverished and desperate people in the world. And I think that's a really important framework that gets lost in a lot of this conversation about immigration or attempted immigration from Central America and Mexico, where obviously people are living in terrible situations, but the situation that they go through to get to America and America's role in creating the system of incentives that leads them there is not much better at all. And again, you just have powerful people who want immigration for various reasons, and what they're doing is creating that system of incentives that leaves people worse off.
Yes, I'd make a few points to try to tie a bow on this. The first one is, I think it is worth underscoring again the point that Rachel made at the top, which is that the safe third country policies, the remain in Mexico type policies, That's international law. That's standard around the world. So this is the only time, it seems, that our open borders ruling class does not prefer international law to American law. They would rather subordinate international law to American law in this case. And by American law, I mean lawlessness, because the entire reason that we're facing this crisis right now is, as per that argument about incentives, that it was a known fact that this lawlessness would be accepted at our borders, and the perception that that lawlessness will be accepted only begets more lawlessness, and it creates a self-reinforcing perpetual cycle that ultimately proves disastrous for the national interest of the American people, which apparently our ruling class does not put first. On Josh's point about identity politics, it's such a critical one. Identity politics, the sort of subtext for the open borders policy, is that everyone should have a right to come to the US effectively. And in particular, those who are the perceived aggrieved lessers in this world, the other. That is sort of the underlying subtext for it. But identity politics is just a mask, as Emily noted, for perceived cheap labor among multinational corporations and beyond, and for Democrats and some Republicans who are naive enough to think they'll actually benefit from it, political power in perpetuity. At the end of the day, this is all about benefiting the donors of the ruling class and then creating what the Democrats and maybe, again, some cowed Republicans or naive Republicans believe is a perpetual political majority in this country. That's what it's all about, and it should be stated every single time this issue comes up. And lastly, what I'll say is that we should make the argument that open borders are callous and heartless towards those who are the weakest. And that is not only those who are being brought here and treated like chattel, and in some cases abused and far worse, but then, of course, for those on the borders who have to bear the brunt, and the American side who have to bear the brunt of it. And of course, the Americans who are competing for jobs and who have to raise their families in a country that is not the country that they voted for when our sovereignty is eroded. So open borders are a callous and heartless policy. They're not a compassionate one.
Well, with that, we can transition to something that is compassionate. And that would, of course, be Dr. Seuss. Now, I want to start by saying, I'm going to start by introducing the counter argument right off the bat, because I saw it from folks like Charlotte Clymer and others. Dr. Seuss was not canceled, we're told. Dr. Seuss was not canceled because what happened is, just as an article in The Guardian put it from a so-called expert in children's books, Dr. Seuss was just recalled. What we're seeing is a product recall. Now, what actually happened is you have 6 books that were being yanked from circulation by Dr. Seuss Enterprises. Now, that also led to places like the Chicago Public School District and certain libraries saying that they would follow suit. And this, the left says, is not a cancellation of Dr. Seuss, because you can still access Dr. Seuss books everywhere. You can get Dr. Seuss if you want Dr. Seuss. He hasn't been entirely canceled. There was just a decision that because of the allegations of racial stereotyping, because of those allegations, we are recalling. There's a product recall afoot of the books in question, the egregious books in question. Now, this does constitute a cancellation, of course, because it sets precedent and it says these books are racially egregious, and it does tarnish Dr. Seuss, and it does lessen the circulation of those books. For instance, eBay blocked sales of some of the books when they were immediately put up on that platform. And there's a lot to discuss here. There's a ton to discuss here. But one reason I wanted to introduce the counter argument is because the left is increasingly eager to paint the cancel culture argument as silly boomer fodder for Fox and Friends. And it really isn't that. They're really deliberately trying to trivialize all of this and make conservatives look like toothless rubes for obsessing over the culture war. And it's an important point to make that in every circumstance, conservatives are on defense in the culture war. We are not just happily fomenting a culture war. We're almost always on defense, because the left, by the definition of the word progressive, is actively trying, and honest progressives will admit this, to knock down and change culture. And so, it's silly to sort of pin the blame on conservatives for talking about Dr. Seuss when they are being told, and when people are being told around the country, that books they grew up loving, and an author they grew up loving, deserves to be punished or should have certain books removed from circulation because they're racist. And nobody really saw them that way, except for sort of people on the hardened left. So there's a lot to talk about here. It's just sort of fodder for a conversation in the context of what we talk about every single week. So who wants to start and dive right in on this?
I'll start because I think I hear this all the time, this argument, right? That, well, Josh Hawley not getting a book deal isn't cancel culture. Oh, you can still buy Dr. Seuss at Barnes, wherever. So it's not really canceled. But I think it's missing the point. It's taking a very literal stance and ignoring, it's missing the forest for the trees kind of situation, because it's not, you're changing the cultural conversation around cultural touchstones. And so, for instance, it's not just Josh Hawley not getting his book deal. It's the fact that whoever's now going to read the book that Josh Hawley put out is now going to be tarred with a certain stain. And it's, whoever reads Dr. Seuss at home to their kids, well, that school's going to tell the kid that their dad is a racist. That I think is the insidious element of cancel culture that doesn't really get talked about, is we sort of see it from a broad perspective against these like cultural icons or, important people, but we forget that it trickles down and it starts to, implement or impact the working class, the people who are getting fired from their jobs, for, having a Parler account or a Gab account.
And they don't have the power, they don't have the power to create a Substack like Barry Weiss and profit off of it.
Yeah. And that's, I think, the unspoken toll of cancel culture is on the people that actually can't fight back. It's the power versus the powerless, the powerful versus the powerless. And it goes back to, I think, a point you were making, which is that the left, and I think conservatives have been complicit in this in a lot of ways. We've ceded the cultural institutions to the left. They control every possible element of the culture, the institutions, the government. And so conservatives feel under attack from all these places, and we have no real outlet for it. And so, I think cancel culture gets its power from that, is that, the middle class can't speak up against this constant assault from all the institutions. So I think it's far more than just the book or just Josh Hawley or, Barry Weiss. It's the trickle down effect.
Yeah, I would make the argument that it goes even deeper to an assault on our country at the end of the day. And the reason I would use such a stark descriptor is, look, let's go back to last summer. The 1619 riots were about destroying our history and presenting America as an irredeemable and deplorable project from its beginning. Yes, now they're going after icons or objects, books and film and beyond that don't comport with whatever the woke doctrine says at a given time and point, even though it's ever changing and anyone can get canceled or anything can get canceled at any point in time. Then there's the pursuit of people, even using the full powers of the federal government against them. So all of this is essentially an anti-cultural revolution that we're witnessing. And it's not about Dr. Seuss or Josh Hawley or even a Clarence Thomas documentary that during Black History Month you can't stream on Amazon Prime. I mean, God forbid. It's way beyond that. This started with, they would throw out a fringe figure like an Alex Jones, but ultimately it's not about that. It is about the power to silence and crush anyone who dares dissent or not comport with whatever the ethos is at the given time among our wokeocracy. And so I view this ultimately as it's an assault on the values and principles on which the country is based. It's not about the individual examples ultimately. It's about what underlies them, and it's about this use of power that's ultimately going to be indiscriminate and ultimately, I believe, is aimed at overturning the order on which the country is based.
Yeah, I mean, what Ben said is exactly right here. I mean, the same people, of course, who are seeking to quote unquote cancel Dr. Seuss are the same ones who are renaming schools after Abraham Lincoln, George Washington. Apparently, Senator Dianne Feinstein is not good enough for some people in San Francisco. They're trying to rename schools named after her, of course, the most pro-Chinese Communist Party senator of the past 40 years. But that's a story for another day, I guess. Look, I'll be honest with you. When I decided to take over the opinion page in Newsweek, I did not think I would be editing, 3 to 4 op-eds about Dr. Seuss in a given week, which is what happened last week. But here we are. I mean, it's really quite crazy. And it kind of reminds me, I'm living here currently in Denver, Colorado. I got coffee this past weekend with someone who I just published in Newsweek today. Actually, we're filming this on Tuesday. A young lady named Helen Raleigh, who grew up in Wuhan, China. Now she lives here in the Denver, Colorado area, writes prolifically on a lot of subjects. But we had a really, really great coffee conversation. It touched on Dr. Seuss, it touched on cancel culture. And what Helen told me, this is the line that's going to stick with me for a very long time. She said to me, I never thought that I would have to fight for freedom twice in my life. And what's going on here with Dr. Seuss, with the Clarence Thomas documentary, thank you for reminding me of that, Ben. I had honestly somehow forgotten about that. I guess I memory hold it. With Ryan Anderson's book on Amazon, all of this stuff, Helen directly correlates all of this with Maoism, with Stalinism, with classic Marxist ideology. This is literally straight out of the Cultural Revolution playbook. So what do we do about that? I mean, that's obviously the $1 million question. And, I think podcasts like this, our conversations like this will slowly tease out some step-by-step solutions. Obviously, we talk about big tech regulation a lot. I think, Rachel, myself, we've all kind of written prolifically on the need to do this. It's not enough. And what that next step is something that I'm not entirely sure. I'll be intellectually humble enough to admit that. I'm not sure any of us are sure how to truly and earnestly fight back and prevent a cultural revolution that is literally unfolding before our eyes. But we have to fight within existing institutions. That's kind of what I'm trying to do at Newsweek, of course. We obviously need to build out our own parallel institutions to the extent they can't just be nuked in Parler-esque fashion by a collusive stream of oligopolists. But there are no easy answers here. We are literally going through a Maoist cultural revolution before our eyes. It's a harrowing thing to say, but I also think it's literally accurate. That is the ultimate goal of people who seek to quote unquote cancel Dr. Seuss. It is, as Ben says, it is not about Dr. Seuss at all. They are coming for George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. That is the very, very clear end goal here. So anyone have any final thoughts on Dr. Seuss and cancellation?
I will just say, to the point you just made, that the only thing that checks power like this is power. Right? Power checks power. And right now, I think the middle of America doesn't have that kind of power. And so I think we tend to when we talk about solutions, we tend to focus just on sort of the cultural aspect and how do we, break some of this cultural power. But I think it's broader than that. Like there's a systemic power imbalance, with, I think, general working class people and the rest of America, because a lot of this cancel culture stuff doesn't actually resonate, I think, with the working class in this country. I don't think that they go in for it. It's these sort of elite white liberals who make this argument, but they're the ones that are empowered. And so I think how we address this has to be, I think, breaking up a lot of the corporate power, decentralizing it. I think giving the working class more power, however they do that through, institutions, or rebuilding a lot of the institutions that used to wield them that power, right? Which can be community organizations, which can be religious institutions, like all these things that used to check, the collusive effect of corporate power with government power just don't exist anymore. They've been broken down by this neoliberal consensus. Michael Lind has written prolifically on this question, obviously. But I think that's reframing the debate in those terms, I think, is going to be critical moving forward, because power is the only thing that checks power here. And we have a massive imbalance in this country.
And I'll toss to Josh, and after just making a quick point, which is that we have this toxic combination of centralized economic power and B, chilled speech. And those sort of make each other worse, right? But they're working together, and that you have you have 83% market share from Amazon in book sales, and then you have nobody who feels comfortable saying, I think it's, Amazon should probably sell Ryan Anderson's book. I think that's a reasonable piece of scholarship. So when you have that combination, you are in a really dangerous situation, and that's where we are now. And with that, I'll toss it to Josh to talk to us about reparations.
Yeah, so I mean, on the theme, obviously, of things that have happened in the past. So look, reparations, this is obviously a particularly fraught and emotionally driven and divisive subject. So, I want to treat it with kind of the respect and candor that it deserves. So HR 40 is a bill currently percolating through the House. It would establish a commission. To examine what we can do about slavery and the lingering effects of slavery. Euphemisms aside, I think we all know what that means. We're talking here about reparations, and it's very difficult to kind of disentangle this discussion from the broader kind of critical race theory, anti-racism, post George Floyd, kind of racial awakening that America is happening. But I would obviously welcome if my co-host would disagree with my stance on this. And I should just briefly note that I am born Abraham Lincoln's birthday. Abraham Lincoln is my hero of all heroes. I've got a portrait literally sitting right up there as I record this. He kind of motivates me in a lot of what I do, at least at a somewhat symbolic level. And I even saying that, I think the Lincolnian stance would actually be to manifestly oppose reparations for slavery. Now 150 plus years after the end of the Civil War. And there are many, many, many reasons to do this. So I wrote an op-ed on this last week for the New York Post. And I'll kind of run through some of the lines of argumentation that I put in that op-ed, and then kind of wrap a bow on it at the end, and then kick it to my co-panelists. So the very first thing that you think of, reparations, especially here 150 plus years later, if we want to get technical from like a law perspective, we would try to analogize it to either the law of restitution, which is kind of entailed with when one party is unjustly enriched at the expense of another, or in traditional contracts law, the common law of contracts going back to England, we would analogize this to compensatory or expectation damages to effectively recompense the other party for monetary damages or to try to make them whole to what they would have been but for the underlying cause. There are some major issues that ought to leap right off the page for a discussion of reparations in the year 2021 with respect to evil, and it obviously was evil, that happened a century and a half ago. Namely, who is paying who? Who is the A who is expected to pay B? It's not immediately obvious that there are clear answers to these questions, of course. I think that the simplest answer would be that every non-Black, whether you're white, Asian, Middle Eastern, whatever, would be effectively taxed to pay reparations to Black citizens in the year 2021. But viewed from like a basic stance of justice, morality, and kind of individual culpability, how on earth does that make sense? I mean, just kind of speaking personally, I'm Ashkenazi Jewish. My family came here during like the great Ellis Island immigration wave. They were not even here when the Civil War took place. But even kind of holding that aside, let's say that you live in Alabama and that your great whatever ancestor actually was a slaveholder. Let's even go there. It's not even immediately obvious to me that it is just or right to hold the great grandson responsible for the misdeeds, the evil misdeeds, to be clear, of that ancestor. Similarly, what about for Black citizens? What about for people who immigrated here from the West Indies, from Africa, wherever it might be, decades and decades and decades after the Civil War? We could do like a genealogical inquiry, but that would be prohibitively expensive. The administrative cost of that would be immense. And to kind of just like make a final point here, I think this podcast is a product of the Edmund Burke Foundation. I think back to a short essay at the Federalist that Edmund Burke Foundation President David Brogg wrote last August, kind of after the true kind of peak of the 1619 riots. And what David said is that a way to do this, to kind of like to bring everyone together, is that we need a more robust, assertive vision of nationalism to overcome all of this divisiveness, all of this racial strife, all of these hierarchies, this intersectional nonsense. We need cohesion. We need people to come together around a unifying vision. I could not think of a more destructive way to just totally throw all of that out the window than race-based divisions to kind of tax certain people to then pay other people back. And the last thing I'll say on this, I concluded my op-ed in the New York Post by basically saying that we always should hold individual racists responsible, always, whether that's morally, rhetorically, punished to the extent that that's necessary here. But from a societal, civilizational perspective, America already paid its debt for slavery, which of course is what historians now currently estimate is almost 750,000 people who died in the Civil War. So if I can just take a brief liberty, I want to just read the very famous final line of Lincoln's second inaugural address, who I think is kind of getting a very similar theme here. Lincoln tragically gave this barely a month before he was assassinated. So it's a very famous line, obviously, quote, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." So, with malice toward none, with charity for all seems to be in, I would say, direct tension with this notion of reparations 156 years later. But perhaps I'm wrong. I'm curious if anyone disagrees with me.
I mean, I'll just say I think this is a an almost impossible conversation to have, because it's impossible to do this in a way that's just, both in terms of who's being taxed and then who's actually being compensated. So to Josh's point about who's being taxed, I mean, all of that is like, that's already difficult enough. But then secondly, how would you distribute reparations in a just way? We're getting into really disgusting and creepy territory when you then have to determine who is black or sufficiently black. Like, this is really, really gross and creepy stuff that would receive reparations. And there may be arguments that reparations should go to institutions, but the argument you hear most frequently is not that. And it's really, I think, that concept is disturbing because it actually sets us back. And that's, I think, the sad thing about the conversation around reparations is that it really, like, you do have to kind of rewind the clock in some pretty disturbing ways in order to say this is how it would be done justly, on both the sort of who are we taking the money from and then who are we giving the money to. And so I just don't think there's any practical way to do this justly. And it's obviously a really popular idea on the left, and it's mounting in popularity because I think it sounds radical. And to sound like these radical policy ideas are, and also there's sort of like the easy fix ideas, right? Like the UBI ideas. There's some of these like real Band-Aid solutions that are increasing in popularity. And I think that speaks to our desperation. And I think that speaks to how deeply a lot of people feel like we need solutions and we need them quickly. But there's just, no way to do this. It's not only impractical, but it's impractical to do in a just fashion. And I think if you spend 5 minutes thinking about it, that becomes abundantly clear.
Yeah, let me just say, I second both of the comments of my esteemed colleagues, and I would point out you could throw more monkey wrenches in it. What about, for example, the fact that there were black slaveholders in the South in the pre-Civil War era as well? I mean, there are any number of ways that, of course, from a practical perspective, this doesn't make sense. And from a moral perspective and a political perspective and beyond as well, it's simply a policy that we ought not to support. But I would go beyond that, and I would say Frederick Douglass provides the perfect antidote to the narrative of those who are trying to support this kind of policy. And I think it speaks to why those supporting this sort of policy support it, which is that they do not want to have a unified country that is truly colorblind and is united by values and principles and a history that transcends race and ought to transcend race and ought to unite all of us. But it's because explicitly they want to perpetuate discord and disharmony in the country. And that's a really cynical and disastrous thing that tears at the fabric of our country. And it belies the notion that ultimately legislation like this has anything to do in the final analysis with achieving justice for anyone. It is a recipe for injustice ultimately to be perpetrated because it's a recipe for discord and disharmony in the body politic.
Yeah, there's not, I think, too much else to be said here, except, I think Ben's point is well said in the sense that if you want to create race resentment in this country, put a race tax on people. I mean, that is not something that brings people together. And it's interesting, I think, just as a personal reflection, I've spent a lot of time talking to my father-in-law, who was, my husband is African-American, and his dad spent a lot of time in DC, grew up here, was part of the race riots in 1968, was part of the protesting, was jailed repeatedly for breaking curfew. Fascinating stories. But when you talk to him about what's going on right now, and I think this may be reflected, I think, in the very older generation of the early civil rights protesters, is that, it wasn't about, there was a little bit about Black power, right? But it was much more about an equitable society. A society in which, that Martin Luther King very eloquently framed in the founding documents. He sort of wrapped himself in the Declaration of Independence, that said, all men are to be created equal. Everybody has the ability to live up to this standard, not just one race or one hierarchy or one class. And that's the promise of America. That is the great ideal of America that makes us the freest country in the world, is that there is no barrier. There's no race barrier. There's no class barrier. There's no gender barrier to entry. All of us have the same rights. And I think very much that was central to the early civil rights movement. And I think talking to people that were part of it, that were treated horribly, right? There's no denying that. But who were part of it and what they were fighting for, it was that. It wasn't this, very sort of reverse racism to the extent that you would impose a tax on people to pay for the sins of their great-great-great-grandfathers. That will not bring us forward. It will only drag us back.
It kind of reminds me of the affirmative action debate. There's some litigation going on against Harvard University. They just filed a writ of cert to the court, which I think they'll probably grant. So we'll probably hear a major affirmative action case at the court within the next year or so. But I think back to a concurrence that Justice Thomas, who of course grew up dirt poor in the Jim Crow South, as the aforementioned documentary makes very clear, didn't even speak English growing up. Actually, when he was very young. Justice Thomas, who was written so stirringly on race-related issues, he had a concurrence in the 1995 case of Adirondack Constructors versus Pena, if I recall, from one of my common law classes. And he basically, the case is about kind of, it's not affirmative action per se, but it's about kind of dividing people along categories of race. And what Justice Thomas basically says is that benign racism, even if it's like, people think it's well-intentioned, it's still racism. Like you can't have it both ways. If you're dividing people by race, that violates the Equal Protection Clause. It violates the entire ethos of the Declaration of Independence. It violates the American Social Compact, period. But on that very happy note, maybe it's time to kind of get some concluding thoughts tossed around the horn. Anyone want to lead us off here?
I'll start really briefly with just a quick negative comment, and then hopefully it'll go from negative to positive as we round this out. But if I try to think about what unifies the issues that we talked about today, in reality, it's about the powers that be, those in the commanding heights, trying to divide us any number of ways in which we can be divided as of course, a divide and conquer and control tactic. And so we get into the substance and the merits of the issues, which we have to do. And it's the intellectually honest and right thing to do. And you're supposed to grapple with arguments in good faith. But we cannot lose sight of the fact as well that at the end of the day, this is about power. And to Rachel's point earlier, the only way to counter that power is to threaten such a cost to that power being asserted that the other side will stand down. And until there's a calculation on the other side of these issues broadly and generally here, they're going to continue to march right over us and continue this perpetual quest to have total power. There needs to be a price that's paid for it in a way where we maintain our values and principles and are consistent with them and the founding values and principles, while at the same time making it clear that there is a price to be paid for trying to trample over us, our rights, our liberties, and our justice.
I think you've hit on something that, in my concluding thought, I'll just say, I think is the work that must be done on the right, because we, I think, have been so narrowly focused that we've missed these massive structural systemic changes that have consolidated power in the hands of a few, and those few are ideologically aligned across the spectrum. And I think it's just created this imbalance that the right, I think, needs to not only address legislatively and politically, but culturally and through institutions. And that is the task at hand. And I think why this conversation about national conservatism and rethinking how we apply our principles in politics is so important, because neoliberalism has ceded the territory. It's ceded the ground. And so we need to, I think, rethink how we apply our principles to confront this new and looming threat, which is fundamental. It's existential and fundamental to who this country is and the rights and liberties of individuals to think and pray and live in a free society, and what that truly means.
Yeah, I guess my concluding thought for this week is just kind of encouraging our listeners, our viewers, to have courage and the conviction to call it like you see it. We live in a time where people are trying to shout you down. They're saying you're racist if you oppose reparations for antebellum chattel slavery. They're calling you a racist if you think that Dr. Seuss, for heaven's sake, should not be canceled. They're calling you a racist if you think that we should have immigration laws like the Remain in Mexico policy, things like that. It's not easy to kind of stand to thwart that. It's actually one of the very best things that President Trump did. I mean, did he overstep at times? Of course he did. He was obviously not rhetorically perfect. He didn't kind of encapsulate that great kind of Roman or Greek, the art of rhetoric or whatever, obviously. But what he did do was he was willing to forthrightly, earnestly, and confidently call out critical race theory, identity politics for what it is. I still think that Donald Trump kind of getting rid of critical race theory in that executive order from this past September, October, whenever it was, after Chris Rufo's reporting, was one of the most courageous acts that a president has taken in decades, because he knew that everyone under the sun would call him racist. And it is incumbent on us to not be cowed, to not bow down to those who would take these ridiculous, scurrilous accusations and toss them in our face for taking manifestly reasonable stances. And then just the very final point, to tie it into what Rachel was saying earlier about the Hispanic voters and borders, this is the key point here. The median American is set for a backlash against all of this overstepping. They really are, whether it's on big tech, on Dr. Seuss cancellations, transgender issues pertaining to women in sports. I really think that if Republicans can find a way to actually stand their ground for once and seize the opportunity here, there is really going to be a backlash. And I predict we'll see it as early as next fall in 2022 midterms.
So on that note, I actually want to disagree slightly with Josh in that I don't think it was brave. I don't think Donald Trump's critical race theory executive order was brave, because I think he, presciently, of any Republican, actually recognized the appetite that Josh just spoke to, that there is an appetite among, ordinary Americans to push back on this. And so while, yes, of course, Donald Trump was called racist by the elites for breathing, there was nothing he did that wasn't called racist. He was the one who said, you don't have to be afraid of these people. And he really never was. And so I think to that extent, yes, so if you were somebody who wants to take a stand against something crazy that your school district is doing in Naperville, Illinois, as we documented at the Federalist this week, it is really difficult. You do have to take the encouragement that Josh just mentioned and muster the courage to, try your best to stand strong and speak truth to power. Absolutely, it's not easy. But the Republican Party, I think, is really learning the lesson that you can stand up to these things, because there is a really, really broad appetite in the public to do so. And it's a matter of just sort of packaging that message in an appropriate way and in an appealing way. And if there is a silver lining to any of this, and if there is sort of a happy note to leave this on, I think we have seen evidence that Republicans are learning that, and that the conservative movement broadly is sort of learning how to talk about those issues and is directionally refocused on handling them. So on that unusually happy note, it's spring, the sun is out, it's like 70 degrees here in DC. I will say, on behalf of Ben, Rachel, Josh, and myself, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Emily Jashinsky, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.